Hello, my name's Eloise Keary. I'm with the World Bank, and our team are here to assist you with any questions that you may have over the next 2 days. Welcome to the International Corruption Hunters Alliance, or ICA. We're delighted to have you here. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping notes for you. I hope you've managed to find the Wi-Fi password, which is displayed on the walls around the building and outside this room. Having said that, please turn off your cell phones and keep them turned off during the sessions. Interpretation is available for all of the panels in this room only in French, Spanish, Arabic and English where relevant. If you refer to the notes in green at the bottom of your session agenda, it will tell you which languages are available. And at the back of the room you can see the channel number for your selected language. Headsets for interpretation can be collected from the back of the room, and please remember as you're leaving the room to return those headsets after each session. You can also see that we have parallel sessions happening across the building in room 2, and we hope that you'll select the panel that's of most interest to you and move between the rooms over the course of our meetings. The restrooms are on the floor below us. We'll be serving lunch on the ground floor today at 12:45 and tomorrow at 1 p.m. And we'll also have morning and afternoon coffee breaks on both days. And I sincerely hope you'll join us for this evening's reception. That's from 5:30 until 7:30, also on the lower level at the other end of the building. I would like to recognise our audiences who are watching online from around the world. This event is streaming at live.worldbank.org. You can follow along on social media with the hashtag #CorruptionHunters. At the end of this discussion, we'll be taking questions from the audience, and we encourage those of you watching on World Bank Live to submit your questions online. And now I'd like to invite Pascal Dubois, the World Bank's Integrity Vice President, on stage to give the opening remarks. Pascal.
Good morning, everybody. I want to welcome everyone to the 4th biennial meeting of the World Bank's International Corruption Hunters Alliance. Thank you for being here in lovely Copenhagen and especially in this absolutely beautiful building. I was told that it was built in 1748. Want to start off by giving a very special round of thanks to our hosts, the Kingdom of Denmark, as well as the Kingdom of Belgium, 2 kingdoms, who have helped us with very generous financial support. So, World Bank has organized this event every other year since 2010, and this year again we have a very exciting lineup. So in the room, and most of the invitees, as you know, are investigators and prosecutors, and we also try to mix it in a little bit by having people from CSOs and also some private sector people. And I particularly want to acknowledge the presence of Transparency International, because we did this on the heels of the very, very successful TI conference. I'm looking at Huguette Labelle and Patricia and Delia, where is, yeah, okay. And so we're very happy that you are with us. And I've been telling the TI people this morning, now you can relax, and now it's, to us to get ready. So I want to tell you a little bit about what we're doing at the World Bank. So as you know, I lead the investigative arm of the World Bank, which is called Integrity Vice Presidency. And in INT, short for Integrity Vice Presidency, we were originally set up as an investigative arm of the World Bank about 20 years ago. That's still our core mandate, and we will always continue to investigate. We receive allegations of fraud and corruption collusion, coercion, and obstructive practices. These are the 5 types of misconduct. And when we received those allegations, a team led by Dave Fielder, and you'll hear from him, on the plenary, will investigate. The main reason why we were set up is to make sure that we follow the money that is entrusted to us by the donors. So we want to make sure that the money that is given to us by the donors is used for their intended purposes. If we receive money and we lend it out for the building of schools, we want to make sure that these schools are indeed built. Now, enforcement alone, though, is not enough. And so what we try and do is we try and maximize those investigations. The good thing about enforcement is that it gets everybody's attention. And once you have everybody's attention, because if you're the bar companies, you very much get everybody's attention. When you make a referral to the institutions that you are representing in this room, that very much gets people's attention. And once you have people's attention, it's a very good entry point to then start working on prevention. And so we're doing prevention in several ways. First of all, at the end of all investigations, we package up the information that we have gathered, and then we share it with people at the World Bank. So I'm looking at Debbie Wetzel, who's the head of the Governance Global Practice, and who's also going to be on the plenary. And in Debbie's group, that information will then be packaged and shared both with people inside the World Bank, so that the next projects that we're doing are better informed, and we can mitigate the damage or avoid it altogether. And through the Governance Global Practice, it's also, this information is also, the data is also shared with our member countries. We also prevent corruption by working with the private sector to promote clean business by giving them incentives. And I want to acknowledge my colleague Lisa Miller, who is there, thanks. And she's the head of the Integrity Compliance Office for the World Bank, and her group works directly with companies who have been debarred to put in place compliance programs. So if a company is debarred, say, for 2 years, before it can be taken off the list, it needs to show to Lisa Miller and her colleagues that it has now put in place a compliance program which passes muster with us. If they don't, they say the company remains debarred. I've been following anti-corruption since about 20 years by now, and I came from the private sector at one point, and what is very interesting to me is that it used to be that the companies would very much look at price and quality. These days, that has completely changed. Companies are looking at price, quality, and very much they're looking at reputation, because the mentalities around the world have changed as well. And which is why I'm very happy today, for the next 2 days, that we have a mixture of all these different lines. Another thing which I've noticed is that private sector companies, once they've been in trouble, and the governments are watching them closely, enforcement is watching them closely, they then become very much part of the solution, in the sense that if you're going to be clean, you want to make sure that your competitors are clean as well. And that is something that we have learned at the World Bank when we try and enforce our rules, being on the enforcement side, is that the private sector, the newly clean or the always clean companies can be an excellent ally for prosecutors. And so that was hopefully something that will come out during the next 2 days. Back to the World Bank. So the World Bank's twin goals are to eradicate extreme poverty and also to promote shared prosperity. And anti-corruption, I think it's clear to everybody, is very much pro-poor. Anti-corruption makes sure that the poor get the services they need. So if we're financing schools or education, we want to make sure that everybody, the intended beneficiaries, get those services. Anti-corruption at the same time is very much pro-business, because it very much levels the playing field. It ensures that companies that go out, especially in emerging markets, that they receive that if they put in a lot of effort to get a particular contract, and they happen to be the ones at the lowest price with the best quality, that indeed they receive the contract. In this regard, there's another thing that has been very interesting is that Lisa Miller started a program of mentoring. So companies that have graduated from the program will mentor other companies that are currently in the program. And that's happened at the level of SMEs and also at the level of big companies. And I think it's a great way to share those experiences, because if you're a first mover, if you're a company and in a country where until now, there hasn't been much attention, being the first ones that become clean, the first movers, is a very tough endeavor indeed, and to put them in touch with other companies who've gone through the same experience is I think a very good thing. So we're very encouraged at the World Bank with the way that anti-corruption has been going. And so we often wonder what we're going to do next. I mean, one thing is clear, is that it's absolutely essential to all work together and, to look at, the links between all of us, because anti-corruption is very much a team effort, also at the bank. So we have actually today all the actors are here at this conference. So we have the Governance Global Practice that I mentioned. There's also the sanctions system, the Office of Suspension and Debarment. I see Jamie Smith sitting there, and the Sanctions Board, Juliana Dunham-Irving. Yeah. There's also people from the STAR Initiative, I see Emile, and MIGA and IFC Due Diligence System, Kerry Lawley, and Judith. Welcome. And so you may be saying there's like a lot of people at the World Bank involved. We're actually about close to 1,000 people involved in anti-corruption and governance out of 26,000. So that shows that, like 20 years ago when we were starting with about 3 people in INT, that's quite a nice number of people that are involved. And at this point, I always like to quote, because I'm from Belgium, our national motto is L'union fait la force, Eendracht maakt macht, which means united we are stronger. And I think this is very much a good motto to start this conference with. I want to wish you all very much an excellent conference, and look forward to hearing from all of you, and very much look forward to the little chats that we're having outside during the coffees, the lunch and the dinner. Thank you very much again.
Hello, everybody. I'm feeling like I'm selling something. So my name is Nicola Bonucci. I'm the OECD General Counsel. And I would like first to thank the World Bank, and in particular Pascal, for asking me to be the moderator of this opening session, which I hope will set the scene and the stage for the next 2 days on this very minimalistic program, which is in the title, Coalition Against Corruption, Building Trust, Promoting Integrity, Ending Impunity in 2 days. Quite a challenge, but we will try to do that. And the first thing I need is to have my panelists with me, because if not, it will be really looking stupid. So may I ask all my panelists to join me on the stage, please? Good. So we will start the conversation, but before that, let me just say a few words of introduction, trying to set the scene, and then I will ask a question to each of the panelists, and I will ask them also to introduce themselves on this occasion. Pascal said this is the fourth event of that sort. Fourth, yes. This is my accent, so I said fourth. it's the fourth event of that sort. I think it's a paradoxical time that we're living, because on the one hand, certainly there's never been a period in which international investigation, cross-border cooperation, be it formal or informal, law enforcement, there has never been a time in which this has been strong. This is stronger than ever. I mean, all the indicators, the objective indicators, show that the level of investigation, of prosecution, of cooperation is stronger than ever. The paradox is that the general perception is that the bribery and corruption industry is not in the decline, on the contrary. It's not a paradox because we all know, but because there are investigation, prosecution, cases or issues that were below the radar screen are now over the radar screen, and so the general perception of the public opinion is that the situation is probably worse than 10 years ago, whereas most of the practitioners will probably say we're doing more than 10 years ago. So I think this is one challenge collectively that we're facing. And the other challenge collectively that we're facing is that our role goes much beyond the classical and traditional role. When I started to work on those issues 20 years ago, the cost, and particularly for an organization like the OECD, the idea was we want to promote level playing field. It's a competition issue. There are diversion of public resources. Fine. We're now seeing that the cost goes much beyond that. The cost is loss of public trust. Radical changes in some of our countries. And this is throughout the spectrum, north, south, east, west, developed countries. So, in a sense, the role and the importance of investigation and prosecution goes much beyond what maybe could have been our own belief 10 or 20 years ago. Even though, I have to say, that coming from a country, Italy, which has some experience on that 20 years ago with the Clean Hands operation, which was in a sense maybe a sort of anticipatory scenario of what is happening in a number of countries today, we could have learned some of our lesson, which we didn't, naturally, as we can see from the results of the elections. And it's at the end of my political speech. But I think there is indeed a particular challenge now for law enforcement and investigators, because what they do or what they don't do, the cost of action, but the cost of inaction is very, very high, because it puts really the basic pillars of our society at stake. So in that respect, I would say that this panel is as topical as ever, and I'm very, very pleased really to be with such distinguished panelists. So, as I said, we're going to set the scene, but naturally there will be a number of sessions during the next 2 days which will go into more details on those themes. But I think building trust, promoting integrity, ending impunity are indeed 3 main challenges that we are all facing today. So with that, I will start by asking a question to each of my panelists. I will ask them to, including their presentation of themselves, to speak for no more 5-6 minutes. After that, I will do what I prefer to do, which is basically, I don't know exactly yet what I'm going to do. It will depend very much on how and what the panelists will say for a second round of discussion. And then we will give enough space, because I think it's very important that those sessions, even though the format is maybe not as conducive to interaction, let's really try to hear from the floor. And also, I think there are some friends listening to us direct live stream. So I will start immediately, because I think we're still on time, so we'll try not to spend too much time. And Dave Fielder, I will start with you. you're in charge of investigation for the World Bank Integrity Vice Presidency. And in this capacity, you work a lot with other multilateral institutions, bilateral development agency, national law enforcement agencies. How can all those people work together to push the anti-corruption agenda forward?
Thanks, Nicola. Yes, as you said, I manage the unit within INT that investigates the allegations of fraud or corruption we receive. We receive open about 60 investigations a year, and we have robust relationships with national authorities all over the world that we can refer information to and conduct parallel, not joint, but parallel investigations. I've been with the bank about 7 years. Before that, I was primarily in the U.S. government, and most of that time at the Securities and Exchange Commission. The successful model that I've seen duplicated many times by INT and other development institutions is, in working with national law enforcement authorities, is first you have to overcome a simple trust issue. Because it's very understandable, and I understand this myself coming from a former law enforcement background. The World Bank and other development institutions that have units like INT were not law enforcement, and so whenever you approach a law enforcement agency with information that they might be interested in pursuing, there's a natural tendency at first, if they haven't worked with you, to literally wonder, who are you, what are your processes, can we trust you? And can we rely on your judgment to be providing us with credible information? But I'd say, you know, over the past decade, we've overcome that issue in many jurisdictions and have helped national authorities prosecute successful cases in the UK, in the Netherlands, in Switzerland, Sweden, Nigeria, Romania, just, I mean, you know, all over the world, but there's many other jurisdictions that we would like to be working with. From my observations, that I think that in the field of corruption, which is, you know, one of the challenges is it is always multi-jurisdictional, the big corruption schemes at least, is that the development institutions are very well placed to receive whistleblower complaints. My observation is we receive better whistleblower complaints than typical law enforcement does, and that's, I think, for one of two reasons. One, if the whistleblowers come from the government, which I'm optimistic about because that is increasing, they are not trusting of their own government agencies to go to them. And they may not know other jurisdictions that they could go to. If the whistleblowers are coming from companies, then they often don't have clean hands themselves, and they're a little worried about approaching a national law enforcement authority that may be in a position to prosecute them. The World Bank can, you know, is in a good position for them to come forward, talk to us, for us to pursue their leads, and ultimately turn over information to law enforcement authorities with or without their identity, because we can grant confidentiality witnesses. Now, more often than not, through the process of working with them, just like law enforcement cultivates confidential sources, we gain their trust, we can broker an introduction to law enforcement, and then they're off to the races and they cooperate with them. But if they still are nervous about doing that, by then we can hopefully have gathered corroborating information to share with law enforcement authorities. So that's kind of what we bring to the table, as well as the ability to quickly launch investigative activities in multi-jurisdictions with a lower threshold than, say, a law enforcement authority might need to obtain authority to do that. However, we're also very limited in what we can do, and this is where the synergies with law enforcement comes into play. Listening to your remarks, Nicola, about, you know, sort of the trend and where we're going, I was sitting here thinking, and it's definitely the case, as you and Pascal both mentioned, that the resources devoted to fighting corruption around the world have grown tremendously and going in the right direction. The cooperation is going in the right direction, but it's you know, the verdict is out at best as to whether or not the situation has improved. One thing that I think has improved, but though that creates challenges for all of us, is The corruption with impunity, which is part of the theme here, I think has changed, but that makes it more challenging. So we have an active investigation now involving a company that made substantial bribe payments into government officials in another jurisdiction. I'm confident, but I don't have the evidence of that. I'm confident that 20 years ago, they would have probably been happy to have made those bribe payments directly. Instead, what they did is they sold their own equipment to a shell company in a third jurisdiction, and then bought it back at a substantial markup. And that shell company, every indication is, then that money was the profit that shell company made was what funded the bribes. At the World Bank, we can't trace the money. And the financial institutions aren't permitted to sort of work for this, but obviously that's the bread and butter of law enforcement authorities. So, but we can sort of bring those first pieces to the table and let law enforcement, pursue them to the end, trace the money, find the government officials, and of course we also don't have jurisdiction over government officials. So, for there to be both redress on the demand side as well as the supply side, it's imperative that we work with national law enforcement authorities.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you. Thank you. You said marvelously well the scene. I would say maybe I will plan to already 2 follow-up questions for you based on your intervention. The first one, you stress a lot the importance of whistleblower. I think some data was released by your vice president, quite striking on the increase of whistleblower. Mm-hmm. I will ask you maybe in the second round to say a few words about this landmark case in Canada, mm-hmm. because I think it's important also for practitioners to see that what they are doing is recognized was recognized by the Supreme Court of Canada, mm-hmm. in an important case in terms of whistleblowing. The second point, this is much more across the board, and we will talk a bit about it. I really hope we will. Is indeed the fact that we're moving. It's always like that. When you start to put the sunlight on one aspect, naturally, the action shifts. Mm-hmm. Okay. So we are having, and your findings totally joins ours, that there is an increased sophistication of the schemes. Mm-hmm. The use of the agent and the distributor or the intermediary as the one physical person. This is much more a legacy of the past. The future is creating 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 shell companies, which then will be used as money launderer, but also as China's walls. And maybe we can say a word, and maybe all the panel can say a word about that, because this is indeed a challenge. Patricia, you represent the civil society. You're the managing director of TI. You had, however, also a life before, so you will say a few words about yourself. But from the perspective of the civil society, and from an institution like TI, which started on a pure advocacy ground, how can you find ways and means in which civil society can cooperate or help law enforcement authorities, international regulatory agencies to push the agenda, not only in terms of policy, but also in terms of the concrete action that David was indicating?
Thank you, Nicolas. So, as you just mentioned, I am the managing director of the Secretariat of Transparency International, and I joined a year ago. And I think I couldn't have chosen a better time for that to happen, given all the challenges that you described at the beginning to set the scene. And it's been also very interesting to see how transparency is actually evolving its work as well, to actually incorporate this no impunity side of things that is so necessary and so relevant. And before moving on to explain a bit what are the different roles that civil society would play, I'd just like to share a big thank you with the World Bank for inviting Transparency International to the table, precisely because civil society is living some very difficult times at present, with a lot of pressure in a number of different countries even in Europe where one wouldn't expect that to happen. And so we very much welcome the opportunity to be here today with all of you and be part of this discussion. Civil society can and should play a very important role in the law enforcement arena. The types of activities, though, that civil society organizations could perform or conduct very much depends on the specific circumstances of the country in itself, right? Because everything from the legal framework of that country, the degree of development or maturity of the law enforcement bodies or authorities within the country, and then very important, of course, the political and social context of the content, then civil society can play a different role, so to speak, right? And there we have a number of challenges there. But regardless of the specific cases, there are three main roles that civil society plays and should be strengthening in the law enforcement arena. The first one has to do with the detection and investigation of corruption cases. And in this regard, the work of non-governmental organizations and investigative journalists really provides a lot of opportunities for cases to become public and then to proceed with the more formal law enforcement side of things. Very frequently what we find is that civil society plays this role of a bridge between the citizens or the whistleblowers and the law enforcement agencies. And so, for instance, at Transparency International, in the countries, we're present in more than 120 countries today, and our local chapters there very frequently operate through local legal and advice centers, which are places where people can receive free and confidential legal advice on their specific cases. And by receiving this information, then Transparency International at the local level may decide to actually bring it forward or to even present a case or submit a formal complaint. In the cases where the law enforcement, as I said at the beginning, where the law enforcement authorities might not have the necessary resources or might not have the willingness or even the autonomy to actually conduct their role, then civil society could take it further and take those other positions in the value chain, so to speak. So to give you an example, in France, our chapter, in collaboration with another organization, Association Sherpa, more than 10 years ago, in 2007, they started a legal battle. They took to the court the situation that Theodore Obiang, then vice president of Equatorial Guinea, how he could be living such a luxurious life in France, having this multi-millionaire collection of cars, etc., while at least all that on the salary of a government official, when at the same time more than 3/4 of the population of his country actually live below the poverty line, right? So it took a long time, but finally last year there was a result, and the court actually said that Mr. Obiang was found guilty of embezzlement, corruption, money laundering, and abuse of trust. And he was given a 3-year suspended prison sentence, and he was also given a 30 million euro suspended fine. Even though everything is suspended, it's still a very relevant case, which provides a good example of how civil society could actually demand or request a case to the courts and actually bring it all the way to the end. It's not the civil society always has to go all the way to the litigation phase, but it was just to give an example that is quite unique. So the second role I would like to mention is the role that civil society plays in terms of representing the population, representing the civil society. We do have an influence there in raising awareness and, for instance, in promoting public support and trust. The trust is one of the topics we're also discussing here today. So what civil society can do in certain cases is precisely to help increase this level of trust from the public regarding specific cases. So an example there also related to TI's work on the ground happened in Brazil. Brazil went through this massive government scandal that involved ridiculous figures in terms of bribery. And it came together with very strong public protests from the society, precisely because they were not seeing that the government officials were actually being taken being held accountable for what they were doing, right? And so TI did play an important role there, in particular when, and sorry, I need some water. It actually asked for some very tricky amnesty law that wanted to be put in place for public officials, and so we were able to make it not happen, and then contribute to that. TI also gave a lot of support to the prosecutor's task force of this particular case, and for instance, in 2016, through the awards that Transparency International provides to corruption fighters, it was then given to this prosecutor task force, and it then elevated the profile. And all these very specific actions contribute very much to not just making cases more available to the public, but then to strengthen the trust in how the public institutions work and how processes are conducted. And very briefly on the third role, because you're already giving me that look.
I'm
Civil
doing my
society.
job. Not very well.
I got it. The support to the reforms and to the rule of law. Civil society organizations can also play a role there by ensuring, for instance, like true separation of powers, or even that there are adequate resources, be it financial, human resources, technical, for the law enforcement bodies to actually be able to do their work, right? And just one very specific example that we have invested a lot on in the last few years is on beneficial ownership transparency, because we do understand that is a critical piece, again, in the chain of, or in the sequence of processes that take place, and we've been advocating strongly for that. In particular, because of all the impact it has on the cross-border cases, where we think cross-border collaboration and exchange of information is actually one of the key challenges that we have. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Patricia. No, I'm sorry to be nasty, but I think it was important for you to highlight the span of activities that a civil society organization like TI can do. And for all the law enforcement people here today in the room on the ground, you know, if you're facing a difficult case, I think one of the first thing I invite you to do is to see if there is a chapter of TI which you can co-opt in a sense or use as an ally on the ground, because as Patricia said, no, sometimes it's difficult for TI to be on its own. Sometimes it's difficult for the law enforcement people to be on their own, and alliances always, I take the motto of Belgium, l'union fait la force, united we stand, works even for that. Just one observation on the French case that you mentioned, because again, in terms of, I think there are two interesting lessons to be drawn. The first one is the right of access of civil society, which was recognized by the French courts, which was the main issue of the battle, which I think is a very interesting tool. You also mentioned, the way in which the case was pursued, which was not strictly speaking bribery or corruption, but it was more like the unexplained wealth order, which is now in the UK, which I think again is maybe in the future one of the tools that law enforcement people and legislators should use more and more to look at cases in which, as David said, stinks, but you don't have the smoking gun, and with actions like the French one or the unexplained wealth order, and as you know, there has been just one recognized by the UK court just last week. I think that we're getting to something which starts to be interesting. And by the way, for those who do not know the case in France, but it's now a case which will be in front of the International Court of Justice, because there is now a case between Equatorial Guinea and France on the non-recognition of the diplomatic communities of the Vice President of Equatorial Guinea, and I'll stop there. Ville, Mr. Ita, you are now the head of OLAF. OLAF is very well known in Europe, maybe less well known outside of Europe. It is the law enforcement agency in charge of investigating and protecting the EU asset. Can you say a few words about this role, but also in more particularly how you can contribute to the transnational fight against fraud and corruption?
Yes, thank you. And if you allow me to introduce a little bit myself, because I'm the newest in the group, being only a little bit more than 2 months in the office. And I'm Finnish. I live in Luxembourg and I work in Belgium, in Brussels. So,
you're a true European.
Yes, absolutely, yes. And my background, I started my career in law enforcement. I was police commissioner and prosecutor. Then I went to the politics, Finnish parliament. I was also in Finnish government, Minister of Interior, especially in charge of police and border control. And then I went to European Parliament, where I was in the Budget Control Committee. And then I was 6 years in a Court of Auditors in Luxembourg. So, and now started in this office, which is really interesting. And I really want to learn for the people and the issues here. And my priority absolutely is a cooperation. And about this question, we have seen the last years, as you too, that the criminals has become more creative and professionals. So it's more challenging for all of us. And the fraud cases we are dealing with, they often take place in several member states, but also outside of Europe. And the profits from fraud are frequently hidden in offshore accounts. Faced with this, there is only not so much that individual investigative authorities can do. National authorities look at cases, report with EU funds in context of their own territory, of course. But we know criminals don't stop to the borders. And there is where we, OLAF, come in. And our added value lies in our ability to see the bigger picture. With our transnational view and, of course, technical expertise in how EU funds are implemented, we can put the pieces of the puzzle together. Due to our established contacts in both inside Europe and outside Europe, we can quickly bring together and coordinate international teams of experts and then solve complex cases. Our state-of-art forensic tools, including text mining and analytical capabilities, also allow us to take on more complex challenges, such as, for example, analyzing the Panama Papers. When the papers were released, we proved that we could go through vast amounts of information identifying matches. Also, our analytical capabilities allow us to recognize emerging fraud trends. And if you allow, I give one example which we had. And this was when the European Union imposed anti-dumping duties on biodiesel produced in the United States, Argentina, and Indonesia. And Olaf looked into this. We monitored and analyzed import flows to identify any sudden changes in the declared countries of origin, as this might point to customs fraud. And indeed, Olaf investigators noticed cases where biodiesel was stored in third countries, such as India and Canada, and then re-exported to European Union fraudulently. Olaf investigators also noticed large amounts of biodiesel coming to the EU via the Western Balkans. Olaf opened an investigation to see if biodiesel was indeed being illegally imported into Europe. So we request assistance from the Western Balkan countries in questions and also work closely together with Dutch, Italian, and US authorities. As a result of this investigation, we found fraud and recommended the recovery of over 2 million euros to the EU budget. This case, we see we work closely with the other EU member states, but also outside of the member states, and then we get the good results.
Thank you. Thank you. I think Olaf is a very interesting institution, which maybe, as I said, is not so well known outside of Europe. You said something which strikes me, which criminals do not stop the borders, stop to the borders, which is absolutely right. But they're very good at using the borders to shield their own responsibility. So I think borders are very well known, actually, by the criminals, but just as a protection more than a barrier. Drago, you are the chair of the working group on bribery, the OECD working group on bribery. Before that, you have been chair of the similar institution in the Council of Europe, known as the Greco. So you have been in the middle of intergovernmental cooperation in the fight against corruption for more than 20 years, or I would say now. First, what is the contribution of the working group on bribery, and what we could do better all together on that front?
Well, thank you for reminding me how old I am already.
I didn't say that. And basically, we have been in the business for the same amount of time, so.
So yeah, well, I started my career as police investigator. I was the head of operations in the Slovenian Criminal Police, and then I switched over to the prevention side, chairing the Slovenian Anti-Corruption Prevention Commission. So I know the problem from both sides, and internationally, as you said, now I'm chairing the working group on bribery, which is basically a group of 44 member states, and what we do is we monitor our member states, how they enforce the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention. And when I say to monitor how they enforce, this is really the most important part of our work. So, of course, we ask from our countries to align their legislation with the convention, and we have another legal instrument which is called 2009 recommendation. We take a look what institutions work there, but the absolute priority for us is how they do enforce their own laws which are following our convention. So even if everything else is okay in the country, if they don't have cases of foreign bribery or international bribery, if you wish, we still don't think that countries are doing fine. And what we see lately is basically that countries are doing a bit more than they have done in the past. But of course, a lot of our efforts is needed to get countries there. We have, if you take, they're available on our website, if you take a look on our report, especially in the phase 4 and 3, you will see that part of the report is always devoted to the enforcement, to cases. And countries, in addition to that, addition to the regular reporting, every year they have to report to the whole group what they do with all of their international bribery cases. We have a book which in October had 1,091 pages, cases only. So we have the list of all international bribery cases dealt with by our member states. And we ask them on each of the cases what they're doing. If the case is being closed, let's say the police investigation stopped or the prosecutor investigation stopped, or let's say the charges are being rejected or the defendants are being acquitted, we ask countries to provide us the original documents on how the cases are being stopped, because we would like to see what has happened, what were the reasons, what we can do better. We also have a subgroup, which is called the Group of Law Enforcement Officials, which is meeting twice a year. And there, police investigators and prosecutors come together discussing open issues. They don't discuss open cases in front of the whole group, of course, but of course, since they have the colleagues there, they do it. And we can see that the level of cooperation is increasing really in the last years. Once a year, we organized what is called GLEN, Global Law Enforcement Network. So we invite all the enforcers to come to Paris to exchange their experience. And since, you know, it is difficult for all of them to travel to Paris, to Europe, we are now, what we do now, we are establishing the, let's say, the regional law enforcement networks. Eastern Europe, Asia Pacific, Middle East, North Africa. Around those days, it has been, or it will be the first meeting of law enforcement network in Latin America. So you see, this is really the absolute priority for our work. And our countries do understand that. And it happens more and more that, let's say, within the group, we have very sincere, sometimes very unpleasant exchange of views between different countries, because if they are not satisfied with the level of cooperation which they get from the other side, then of course there is questions. And even when we start, let's say, regular monitoring process of a country, let's say country A, we ask all other countries, can you please tell us if you have any problems with that specific country in the form of their illegal cooperation? So we see how this country is being engaged. Of course, by saying that things are improving, we are not there yet. If you take a look on the last Transparency International report on how our member states are enforcing the convention, you will still see that roughly half of the countries, a bit less this year, still didn't deal with not one single case of international bribery, which is already strange if we deal if we discuss smaller jurisdictions, like my country, Slovenia. But it's we absolutely cannot understand that huge jurisdictions in the past years have not been able to identify one single case of international bribery. If they need the help, we offer them the help. We had one of the countries from G7, which came to us saying, sorry, we don't know how to do it. So we organized what we call technical mission. We collected, let's say, the best experts from other countries, send them to the country, and try to teach them how to do such investigations. Of course, we don't keep this closed in the circles, because we need the input, we need the information on the cases which have happened. And let's say the booklet which I mentioned, 1,091 pages booklet, the majority of cases which are in there got in there based on the media articles. And what happens, and I found this very strange, we have countries which learn on their cases from this book. So it means they were not able to investigate or let's identify the cases by themselves, but they're reading our book and they see, there's somebody, let's say in Argentina, somebody's writing about the case which happened in, I don't know, let's say, Slovenia. So let's take a look. And this is why we are opening a bit in the last years. Now you can see the agendas of our meetings on the website. We even publish the summary reports of our meetings. When we go out to the country, we take care that NGOs in that specific country know that we are coming. So what they can do is, and they know what are the questions which will be asked to the governmental side. So what they can do is they can send us their responses to our questions. And we had the case of another G7 country where we got a full-fledged, let's call it shadow report on the questions asked to the government. And this was, of course, really, really helpful because it enabled us to ask us unpleasant, nasty, or silly questions, if you want, to the government. But the bottom line, we got a very good report. Of course, the country was not very happy because the number of recommendations, and all our reports have recommendations, was very high. But at the end of the day, they were also happy with them, which means working together really pays. And this is the area, and this is the direction we will go even further, more in the future.
Thank you, Drago, for this full description of the success, but also the challenges that the Working Group on Bribery is facing. Let me plant a question. I don't know if we will have time because I see that we're running a bit late, and I really would like to give an opportunity to the floor. But let me challenge you on one aspect, and this has to do with the point made by Dave about the impunity. I think there is a perception, again, we're talking a perception that the issue of impunity is not so much, I mean, there is impunity even for the briber and the companies, but the issue of impunity which really touches a strong chord is the impunity of the public official or the high-level politician in the country, what we call the demand side. And clearly the Working Group on Bribery has been focusing very much, this is the mandate of the convention, on the supply side. So maybe if we have time, you can say a word about how we can, from the WGB perspective, also try to tackle the demand side in maybe creative ways to look at that. We've been focusing a lot in this panel, Debbie, you are the head of the World Bank Governance Global Practice. We've been focusing a lot, and I will ask you to introduce yourself also. We've been focusing a lot on investigation, collaboration. At the end of the day, those are crucial, sine qua non actions, but they are not sufficient because we are treating the symptoms. But how much are we treating the disease? And it's not the role of the law enforcement authorities to treat the disease, to try to find the roots. This is maybe more your institutional role. So how can we rebuild trust? Very simple question. You have 6 minutes to answer.
6 minutes, okay.
No problem.
So thank you very much. I'm Debbie Wetzel. I'm the Senior Director of the Governance Global Practice at the World Bank. I'm an ICA alum. I've been here quite a few in all the events, and I'm delighted to be here today. And I'd like to thank Pascal and the INT team for the great partnership that we have. You just mentioned the issue of when public servants are the ones that are demanding the bribes. And this question of trust is really very foundational for governments and the way they work and the way they function in society. And what we see is that as corruption occurs, it's really corrosive of trust, and it is corrosive for the whole relationship between citizens and the state. And you, all of you sitting in the audience, are the people who are the keepers of trust. Because when something goes wrong, you are the ones that are out there investigating and righting the wrongs. My job in the World Bank is to try to keep you underemployed, which we try to do. We have teams all around the world working on a range of issues, but clearly I think you're all very busy. But I'd like to talk about 3 ways at the World Bank in which we are trying to make you underemployed. So the first is we spend quite a lot of our effort in supporting the institutions that help prevent corruption in the first place. So our ideal is that we don't have corrupt acts. We know it's not a perfect world. We do that in a number of ways. We do that by working with the traditional government systems, so building transparent budget systems, trying to make sure the civil servants are paid sufficiently so they don't need to take bribes, trying to make sure that conflict of interest legislation and other such things are there, trying to make sure that government is inclusive of civil society so that the policies put into place are effective. We also work a lot on issues around strengthening public accountability institutions. So things like income and asset declarations, Freedom of Information Acts, working with supreme audit institutions, judiciaries. We don't directly work with police and law enforcement, although we sometimes work with governments about how to manage those forces effectively. We work on leveraging transparency and access to information. And more recently, we're doing an awful lot of work with technology. So working on something we call GovTech, on civic tech, so using technology to get citizen input, trying to use all these tools that we have. But we also find that there's so much technology and so much data out there that we need to do more work on data literacy. So data literacy, helping people who see all this information, they're able to use it and either to report to you or to report to civil society so that this information can be used effectively. That sort of puts in place a lot of institutions, commissions, laws, lots of things like that. Another area where we're working very hard is to try to understand the underlying forces that actually are causing the corruption. And this gets to a really hard thing. It gets to power, and it gets to politics. Who has the power? Who is able to bypass laws, to come up with informal arrangements that allow them to take their cut? Why is such behavior possible, and what can we do to try to prevent that? So we do pieces of work trying to sort of identify oligarchs in certain countries and how they interact. Really trying to understand the roots, and what we find is the more inclusive we can be, the more openness, the more transparent, and the more we can work to improve the norms and standards of activity around the world, the better we can do at confronting those very, very difficult issues. They're not easy by any stretch. And then third, let me talk about the last area among a few that we work on is Pascal alluded to in her opening remarks about efforts to try to work towards clean business and a level playing field. So the Governance Global Practice works with many organizations to support beneficial ownership, to support transparency in procurement, to support all the work that's going on globally on issues around tax evasion and tax avoidance. And so we do a lot of work within countries, but then we also have a big role in trying to make sure that those things that happen across borders are also being considered and taken into account. So let me stop there. There's lots of things, and I think it's probably better to leave time for questions and for conversation. But we're delighted to be here. I would like to put you all out of work. I'm not sure we'll succeed anytime soon. But that being said, when we don't put you out of work, the role that you play in making sure that when crimes occur, that there is not impunity, that is critical to the deterrence that is needed to get us on a better path.
Thank you, Debbie. I think it was a very nice way to conclude this first round of session, opening the discussion. And before giving the floor, and I hope there will be questions. If not, don't worry, I will have plenty to fill the room in any case. But again, one observation, because we've been talking a lot about cooperation between civil society, between law enforcement agency, I think actually the challenge for the future is what I call the cooperation 2.0, because what we are seeing more and more, and a number of interventions were around that, is that the fight against corruption is also intimately linked with issues like anti-money laundering, tax evasion, illegal trade, bid rigging, economic financial crimes in general. And one of the difficulties, we have the borders, but we also have the borders in our institutional settings. And again, this is another challenge that we're facing because we have agencies dealing with all those issues, but in a sort of salami approach, whereas naturally criminals are using and creating offshore to perform a number of functions, or mixing, black money and white money, laundering, gray, and all this is really, unfortunately, let's be very frank, a competitive advantage that criminals have vis-à-vis law enforcement authorities. So with that, I really would receive a lot of questions. I see Delia from TI. I see a second one. I think you need to, a third one. Perfect. We will start with those three, and I think you need to move to the mic. If you could introduce yourself before asking the question, thank you.
Delia Ferreira, Chair of Transparency International. Thank you for the presentations, wonderful panel, and for your comments also, Nicola. 2 questions regarding future challenges, or already here, but increasing. Regarding technology, for Dave, you talk about follow the money. I think that cryptocurrencies are making our work much more complicated, so I want to know the position of World Bank in this realm. And technology, and for Debbie, you mentioned the underneath foundations of these problems, which is power, one if one. Technology and algocracy and artificial intelligence means for me a complete change in terms of power. We are ready to fight corruption in terms of approaching or having to account executive, legislative, and judiciary powers. We are facing new power distribution here, so how can we take or hold to account this very much concentrated power scheme that is coming with technology? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Delia. So Debbie, if you could answer quickly.
I'll tackle the technology question because it poses, I absolutely agree with you, Delia, it poses an increasing challenge. It's the next level of sophisticated hiding of money transfers. I mean, I guess, fortunately or unfortunately, it doesn't pose any greater challenge to INT tracing cryptocurrency as it does tracing just regular currency. We don't have compulsory powers over the technology that cryptocurrency flows through. So, but we are aware and have 2 cases that I can think of where we have witness testimony that we've shared with national authorities that is how at least a portion, in both cases for some reason, not all, but a portion of the bribes flowed. It's similar, I would analogize it to also what worries me and what I'm seeing increasingly, which is the use of anonymized text messages instead of traditional email. You know, fortunately, the crooks are most of the time, they're still sloppy. I know, I wonder now why anyone sends emails to facilitate, you know, corrupt payments when there are other more sophisticated methods, and we've seen some of that. Now, fortunately, the only instances I know of it, which are several, is because there's no honor among thieves. So one of the recipients of those text messages will keep a snapshot or something like that that then they will later share with us. But technology is, you know, right now, I don't mean to be pessimistic, and I'll just wrap. Right now, it seems like technology is also something, as Nicholas said, that is giving the criminals a competitive advantage. We're all behind, and I know there's some encouraging initiatives using blockchain technology, et cetera, that may really help in the fight against corruption. But I think we're playing catch up to the crooks on the use of technology right now.
Yes, and our new director of financial affairs is very fond of blockchain and organized the very first global forum on blockchain. I think on technology, like in everything else, at the end of the day, you know, it can be used for both purposes. The question is how we can use it for good purposes and try to limit the use or abuse or misuse of technology. But it is indeed a challenge, and there is indeed also, I would say, an asymmetry of information and knowledge and understanding of those. I still not understand exactly what is blockchain, to be honest. So, Debbie, the second question.
So 2 things. Well, also I wanted to just add in on the first question. So just 10 days ago at the annual meetings in Bali, the World Bank, the IMF, and the International Bank for Settlements set out 12 principles on fintech, which are trying to set the standards for financial security in a digital age. And so I would refer you to that because it's a coordinated global effort to try to think about how financial security can be improved as the individuals who are using these different technologies are getting ahead of us. And so I think the community, international community, is recognizing that, and we're starting to work through some principles on that. Delia, it's really interesting because technology and the way the world is moving is really, it allows for concentration of power at the moment in a number of big corporations. At the same time, the new technologies and social media give individuals a lot more power than they've ever had before because it allows them to coordinate amongst themselves. So they can do things in these horizontal groups, like create currencies, that in the past were always the realm of the state. And so what we see happening is a shift from a very vertical set of trust relationships. So people always trusted the government, the church, traditional forms of organization. And now we're seeing a shift towards different types of trust. So people use Airbnb, they use Uber, they trust anonymous groups much more because of the information that technology provides. That requires us to think about how do we use these new mechanisms both to hold power accountable. So the Panama Papers is a perfect example of how new information, new technology put a different way of putting prime ministers and other powerful people on notice if they were not acquitting themselves in the way one might have expected. But we also need to recognize the downside of technology when it can be used, when information can be used against individuals. So it's a brave new world in many respects. And I think we're all trying to work through how these new relationships are sorting themselves out. I think, again, your work as law enforcement for identifying when things go awry and trying to find how to address that, and then keeping ahead of it, using all these new tools to track information and finding ways to sort through and sift that information. We're doing a lot of work using big databases, data analytics, artificial intelligence to identify issues in procurement, for example. So you can tell from the data if a price is way out of line, or you can identify patterns of capture and collusion by looking at big data. So we have some interest in work. So that gives us a whole set of new tools to process things faster. So there's pluses, there's minuses, and we all are going to need to work together. United we stand to adapt to this new world.
So I think, yes, please. Yes, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Rana Akoum. I come from Lebanon. I'm a judge and at the same time the focal point for anti-corruption cooperation at the Ministry of Justice. My question is to be addressed to Sir Drago Kos. Thank you for your interesting presentation. You mentioned that the G7 countries are seeking the reports which are released by the OECD in order to learn from the techniques that are placed in these reports so that they be able to run well on the investigations they are undergoing in their countries, especially on crimes related to bribery. My question is, it may seem a simple question maybe, is it really a matter of lack of knowledge, expertise, or skills, or rather a matter of lack of senior political commitment to fight these crimes? Thank you. And to catch the big fish.
Very simple question.
Very simple one, it's indeed. Just a small correction, all our countries have to produce, we are producing reports for all our countries, not only for G7. But, but G7 country asking for technical assistance, of course, not all of us believe that this is really the case. But we had to do it so the country now does not have an excuse anymore. What you raised, I think what you raised, it really is a problem now, not only, or let's say, I could not say about the specific country, but let's say, we see this in many of our countries that, let's say, to put it very mildly or diplomatically, the fight against bribery, general one, or let's say international bribery, is not always a priority from different reasons. We have in our convention, there's Article 5, which prohibits, let's say, any limitations on investigations, prosecutions, adjudications based on political, diplomatic, economic relations, or identity of the persons engaged. And sometimes we have to use it. In other words, sometimes we say in our reports that countries don't want to do it.
I think your question touches a very difficult situation, and what Drago indicated. First, one consideration. This notion of political will, it's complex, because the political will you can have in a country a certain amount of political will, and then a certain amount of realpolitik, and those two clashes. The example that Drago was giving, and we all know this is public domain, so I can mention this, in the BIA investigation in the UK, clearly you had a conflict between a certain amount of political will to be seen as doing something, and the reality that they didn't want to investigate a very well-known UK company which could have had a repercussion on jobs and other things. So there is a tension, and I think it would be a bit naive to believe that there is a political will from A to Z on the spectrum. A lot will depend on the tone from the top in a country like in a company, and a lot of it will depend also on what are the transparency that is there. So Article 5 is indeed a tool which is very important for the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, because it allows to question and put at stake the political will or the lack thereof. But it is a very difficult question indeed. I think there was a third gentleman who had asked for the floor. Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is George Bamugeme. I'm Deputy Inspector General of Government in Uganda. Mine is a comment, and it's really a continuation of the discussions that were held over the last 3 days across the river. And it's about listening to the panel this morning, and thank you very much. I was just wondering the skills that I was hearing. Everybody sort of represents a unique capability and skill, which is essential in the fight against corruption. At the meeting the other day, there was, I think, one of the speakers who was warning that anti-corruption fighters stand the danger of becoming an industry in themselves. And I get a sense that we are at that point in time where we need to organize ourselves in a way where we can leverage on the special skills and capabilities that each actor has and find a way of pulling it together. We're listening to somebody from Kenya the other day said in their country, the president who is serving a last term has literally forced all the agencies to come together and so they can deploy their skills in the best way possible. I mean, if a corruption challenge has arisen from one angle and there's somebody, a member of one of the agencies who is best placed to fight it, then that person is deployed to do so. I just wanted to get a sense from the panel or from the audience here, what we can do to fast track that movement where we can actually turn ourselves into an effective force and not slide into an industry. Here we've had 3 people, I think, from Europe, each one saying very nice things. I mean, the things they do. And you kind of wish there was one roof where Olaf and somebody else and Itratia, made their contribution. I think it would be wonderful. So that's a question I was asking. How can we fast track our movement towards achievement of that goal? Thank you.
Who is brave enough to try to answer to the question?
I'll have
Debbie.
You want me to have a go? So this year, it's Transparency International's birthday, 25 years. So a big congratulations to them. The World Bank has been at the anti-corruption business, at least overtly, since 1997, when Jim Wolfensohn made his Cancer of Corruption speech. Working on a little bit before that still. So I think ideally we would love all to be able to fast track and say we can solve this problem quickly so that it just goes away. But I think actually what is needed is to join forces in each of the different environments, so whether it's in a country environment, whether it's international actors, to try to help governments and societies create these credible commitments. So we talk a lot about political will. I don't actually believe in political will because I think each individual is doing their job and in most cases trying to do the right thing, sometimes not trying to do the right thing. But what they're looking for is for an agreement that gets them sort of where they want to go. So finding ways that we can help politicians and citizens and private sector come together to identify agreements that are transparent and that can be held accountable and move the ball along incrementally, I think is a way that will take us forward. And I don't actually think the fight is ever going to go away. I think at the closure of the ceremony yesterday, it was, yes, we'll continue to fight on, but we know that that fight is going to continue. It was Martin Bielis, the Nordic secretary, I believe, that said that. All the mechanisms for coordination were very keen, and I think that's absolutely important. But working together, it won't be fast. It'll just be a continuous, ongoing thing that we all need to continue to work together on. I'm sure that's not the answer you wanted, but...
Mile, I think you want to say a word. Patricia, Drago, everybody. So, you want to say a word?
Shortly, I think this most important one. Being in politics, I believe in political will. We need to have it. But looking at this cooperation, which we are now, everyone agrees it. But what happens in practice? What I have now learned, it's many times, we have a good cooperator, some other organization, we make a working arrangement or other kind of arrangement. We sign it, we take a picture and put it to Twitter and then put to our report that now we have a good cooperation, but that's all. Then in practice, there's no cases. And why it's no cases, it's not so much about political will, but there are a lot of, it's a mindset and trust. Can we trust? And of course, legal obstacles. Like when we have some cases, then I ask my legal service and the other part ask their legal service, and the both came with a lot of restrictions and obstacles to say that this is no. But if we change the mindset and say it for the legal service that make it happen, give us a legal basis to do it. We have to change this thinking, and then we can do it. I really want to see that this cooperation happens in practice, not only in the documents.
Thank you. Patricia.
Yeah, well, following up on that point, I think on the commitment side, both at the conference for the last 3 days, but I think actually throughout the year at different points in time, we have been stressing the point that we have enough of those commitments and then we have to move into action. And so from our perspective as civil society and Transparency International role, we commit to dedicate more to the monitoring of those specific commitments, to actually ask for no more new commitments, but just to see, we make sure the ones we already have, we can actually move on with. And then there's another aspect from the civil society perspective, which is to, in this new scenario, so to speak, that we are in, and this is why I said at the beginning, we welcome very much this opportunity to be here today. We need to share more. We need to have a space for the conversation to happen between the different actors. So yesterday in the afternoon, for instance, I had a very good opportunity to participate in a side meeting there in the conference with representatives from civil society. And this was actually the key thing that we all agreed. So on the one hand, we would welcome very much the opportunity to engage more with law enforcement authorities and officials at local level and at global level, so that we can then find a specific, or bring together this specific project plan or work plan where each one of us might have a specific role, but we first come together and decide on how that's going to look like. So.
Thank you. Drago?
Well, I would say that we already live under the same roof. We just live in separate rooms. Why do we live under the same roof? Because if anybody of you becomes really effective, it becomes also threatened. This is the destiny you share all over the place. And you're right. This is an industry developing, and industry, as any other industry, is also exposed to corruption risks itself. So what to do? I think what we'll have to do is that the cooperation. First, following what Ville has said, when we will deal with cases or with, let's say, issues of potential cooperation, we will first have to look on what to do it, not on what to do not to do it. And if this will change, then there will be already a major step forward. And second, when in all my career, when there were law enforcement, investigators, or prosecutors, or judges willing to work together, and I leave aside now the question if this is their original, genuine will, or is it a will imposed from somebody from above, if they're willing to work together, they will always find a way, respecting their, let's say, respective legislation, but they will always find a way. And that's why we invest so much energy and efforts to bring investigators, prosecutors, and judges, judges not yet, but investigators and prosecutors together, because they always find a way.
Thank you. I will take two questions because I then will like to give my panelists a word of conclusion. So Seda from IMF first, and then the gentleman, and then I will stop. Thank you. And sorry, before, so I will ask you to give me one reason to be optimistic and one reason to be pessimistic.
Thank you, Nicola. My name is Seda Ogada. I'm Deputy General Counsel at the International Monetary Fund. And I just wanted to share with the audience my thoughts or some of our thoughts on this issue of collaboration. Recently, the IMF Executive Board adopted a new enhanced policy for addressing governance and corruption vulnerabilities in our member states. This was in April of this year. And under that policy, one of the things that we're doing is we had been criticized for only looking at the demand side of corruption and not looking at the supply and facilitation side. So one of the things that we're doing, which I think represents a very concrete example of how we can collaborate and avoid this approach that Nicola referred to as a salami approach, is we are relying, we have had an agreement with the working group on bribery, with Drago and the Secretariat of the OECD, to rely on their reports when we look at the supply side and facilitation side. They are the experts, they're the ones who know how members are implementing the anti-corruption, the anti-bribery convention. So we, in our own staff reports, are relying on their work. So it's a win-win situation in that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. But I think OECD also benefits and the working group on bribery because our reports have a very wide currency within the markets, within policymakers. They are followed by civil society. So I think that's one very concrete example of collaboration. Under that policy also, when we assess the nature and severity of corruption in or governance issues in our member states, we are now working also very closely with the World Bank, Deborah. We have basically a quarterly system in which we look at countries every quarter, a bunch of countries every quarter. We make our initial assessment, and then we sit with Debbie and her team and ask them, this is what we think about the governance and corruption vulnerabilities in this country. What do you think? Does this make sense? From your perspective, is there anything that you can add? So these are just small examples, but I think very concrete and not just sort of talking about it, but doing something in practice.
Thank you. Thank you, Seda. They are indeed very concrete responses to the gentleman of Uganda. Oh, 15 minutes. Oh, because in any case, my notes says that the panel finished at 10:40 p.m. So, relax.
Settle in.
Take a pisco sour. We have a lot of time. No. Okay, 15 minutes. That's good. So, gentlemen, and maybe I will then take another question, but I will still want to conclude with one reason to be optimistic, one reason to be pessimistic. Please, go.
My name is Walid. I'm from Lebanon. Actually, I'm coming from a country that now is suffering from a crisis, from many issues. The first of all, we have a high level of corruption, as you know, and we have also an economic crisis, and we have a crisis coming from refugees. We have around 2 million refugees, Syrian and Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, and we are a country of a population less than 4 million, so we have more than 50% of the population as refugees. From the corruption point of view, as this International Corruption Hunters Alliance, which is a very important title actually, we're looking forward to see what this program or what this International Corruption Alliance team will provide to a country like my country, what help you can provide, what support you can do as World Bank and as developed countries. I'm from a developing country, you used to name it as a developing country, but it's not anymore, we are collapsing. Thank you.
So in a sense, it's a bit of continuation of the same question. One thing I would maybe add is, first, the level of collaboration between international agency and civil society has never been stronger than today. So again, I'm the first one to agree that we could do better, but if you go back to how it was 10 years ago compared to today, it's an impressive progress were made. I think the challenge, maybe trying to respond to your question, is how to translate this international collaboration in a more local and ground and concrete day-to-day collaboration at the level of the citizens. And I think it goes back to this question of trust. We have difficulties in translating this genuine, because I think it's what Seda said, it's also a very strong this genuine level of collaboration, but which honestly touches upon a sphere of 1% of the population which are aware of that, into more concrete action for the day-to-day life of the citizen. And that's probably, thank you for giving us this challenge. I don't have an answer. I don't know if anybody wishes to try to answer, but I think this is really the collective challenge that the panelists and the institution that represents, including OECD, have to face in the future. I think I will take a last question, and then I will give the floor to my panelists to conclude.
Bonjour, merci panélistes. Je suis Ali Ram, je viens du Maroc, de l'instance centrale pour la prévention de la corruption. Ma question nette, bref et directe. Est-ce qu'il y a des innovations dans notre lutte contre la corruption où on va rester lié à notre norme, à notre moyen de lutte? C'est-à-dire le constat, le bilan, il existe que l'échec, c'est une réalité internationale, mais est-ce qu'il y a des innovations dans les normes, dans notre préoccupation de satellite. Et merci.
So I will translate the question for those of you. The gentleman from Morocco asked if there are innovative tools, innovative approaches to the fight against corruption. I think I will ask all the panelists to respond, but I think that, I'm sorry, I will respond in English, but we can continue the discussion after in French. But I think we are already given some examples. As I said, if we are really talking about techniques, I think the case in France and the unexplained wealth orders are a very interesting tool that we should really start to look more seriously as a way to get at criminals from a different angle than having to prove full-fledged bribery, because basically the idea is that the person who has, like in the case of the Vice President of Equatorial Guinea, or in the case of the UK, she's the the daughter of the former president or prime minister of Uzbekistan, who have really a wealth which is completely disconnected from the official revenues. The idea is that the person has to explain how this wealth was originated, and if it is he or she is not able to explain it, then there are measures, sanctions, seizures, and confiscation. I think this is an interesting tool. I think there are in the technology, as Dave indicated, there are things to be worried about, but there are also opportunities there. A lot of opportunities there, both in terms of e-procurement and other transparency tools. But I think also that the level of collaboration, as I said, informal collaboration, when I started to work on those issues, the collaboration was very formal. Prosecutors were not used to speak to each other. I think this has changed dramatically. But again, I don't want to monopolize. Maybe others want to say a word about, I don't know, do you have anything which you say, this is interesting, new, that you can share with the gentleman from Morocco?
I could mention a few things. I don't
Sure.
want to talk too much. So we have a number of things that we're using around the world in environments that are fragile. We are using technology. We're enabling citizens. So when we're doing infrastructure projects on the ground, we activate citizens, sometimes students, to go every day and take a picture that's geotagged and time tagged to see whether the infrastructure is actually being built according to specification with the right amount of concrete and the specific things. So it's a fairly simple thing, but that gives us some immediate impact. We're using cell phones in citizen feedback forms to, once they leave a health clinic or they leave a particular service that they've received, they can give input on whether they received the service, whether they had to pay a bribe. We have a specific, some pilot evaluation programs in the northeast of Brazil where we're doing this type of work. We're using satellite technology as well to do mapping of particular activities to see whether roads are actually being built where they should be built. So there's a whole host of things which our team the leader of our team from the Middle East, North Africa is here, very involved in the technology work that we're doing. So maybe we could talk on the side about some of those things.
Sure.
I'll say then briefly about going back to Delia's question about technology. I think right now technology in terms of money flow, whether that's traditional currency or cryptocurrency, as I mentioned, I think right now we're behind the ball, and the criminals are able to use that technology more to their advantage than their detriment. It shouldn't be that way, and it doesn't have to be that way. If you think about it, I mean, the hardest, and I've actually seen this in a few sophisticated cases where they've gone back old school and used bags of money, because then there's really no trace. So the fact that criminals now use more and more sophisticated electronic means for money flows, or they want currency in another, they want another country's currency, whether that's British sterling or US dollars or whatever it is, that creates a trace. And if law enforcement authorities and all of us are really ahead of them on the technology, then that would actually be to our advantage, not their advantage, which it is now.
Thank you, Dave. So, time to conclude. Coalitions against corruption, building trust, promoting integrity, ending impunity. One reason to be optimistic, one reason to be pessimistic, 1 minute per head. Debbie, yes.
So the reason to be optimistic is that we are seeing more action than ever before. Around the world, you see cases being elevated, being prosecuted. You see leaders falling left, right, and center much more than one might have expected. And so I think that means that something is working. The system is having effect and taking hold. In the past, cases might have gone forward and never been actually brought to full fruition with the leader stepping down. And so I'm optimistic for that reason. What I worry about is the unintended consequences. So I worked in Brazil for a long time, and what I see is heroic efforts and an absolutely fantastic success rate in identifying, investigating, and prosecuting corruption. But at the same time, what I also see is a complete collapse in trust in institutions and in government. And so when this is the paradox of fighting corruption, when we fight it successfully, then we lose trust. And so how can we work together to think about achieving success, but then not leading to, we'll find out this weekend what happens in the Brazilian election, but if it proceeds as we think it looks like it's going to proceed, you can guess that we're not going to have the same type of prosecution of corruption. So how do we balance that? And we say that in other countries.
Thank you, Debbie. Drago.
What was it, a negative or a positive one?
I think it was a
Positive
worry.
and then a worry.
Okay, so I'll start with the worries first. What worries me very much is, let's say, the current trend of anti-globalism, I call it that way, is really putting the need to fight corruption aside in some countries. So anti-corruption fighters in some countries are being the laughingstock of politicians. They're being called parallel state, deep state. They're, let's say, the politicians laughing on, or let's say, changing the national legislations against the international legal instruments are getting support from, let's say, other famous politicians or foreign politicians, saying, well, fighting corruption, it's dangerous, it is motivated by different reasons. This has all happened before. But now it has been, let's say, raised to a level which we've never been before, that fighting corruption means being exposed to laughter of the politicians and those who follow them or who are being paid by them. So this is something which is really causing some worries. On the positive side, you mentioned it already, Nicola, we never had, and I will speak globally, we never had so good anti-corruption laws in place as we have them now. We never had so many really capable, experienced, and devoted anti-corruption institutions. And we never had so many anti-corruption fighters, if you wish, who are deeply aware of all the challenges ahead of them. They have all the necessary technical knowledge, and they're willing to do it. With other words, we have planted, or our predecessors have planted, too many seeds that we could fail now.
Thank you. Ville.
Positive side, I think this shows, this conference, that we really understand and we have this strong will that we have now cooperate. We are in the last edge to take the step to show that we really need to have the action of cooperation. In fact, I have last week discussion with your organization because okay, we have good cooperation, but it's in a little bit different level than in practice, because you have much better touch for civil society, and your whistleblowers are different people than us, so even we can work in practice much better ways. The negative, it's what Drago says, quite the same. It's populism. It's especially growing in Europe, but I think all over the world. And then the international cooperation, it's not very popular in this idea, and I hope we can change that mood.
Patricia.
So on the optimistic, I would say we're close to this critical mass that we need to reach that point where things start to happen. And I can say in this year that I have spent already with transparency and in touch with a number of players in the anti-corruption field, I do get this understanding, and examples like today just confirm that. I am civil society, so pessimism is not part of the DNA, but yes, our reason for concern is what I highlighted at the beginning, and it is the pressure that is being happening precisely to actually quiet or cancel out the voice of the civil society. So attacks on media, the assassination of 3 journalists in less than 1 year in the European landscape, attacks to our even Transparency International chapters in a number of cases, and very recently, and all those things are increasing at an alarming rate, and that is, of course, a great concern for us.
Dave?
Real reason for optimism, I believe, is the trend that we've seen in the past decade in whistleblowers. A vast increase in the number of whistleblowers from government agencies, and it's generational. It's usually the younger generation in those government agencies that are coming forward, which I believe represents the fact that the newer generations are less resigned in accepting of corruption. So that's both reason for optimism, because that's fundamentally that change in stigmatization, if you will, of it is what drives the solutions to all of the hard problems that have been discussed. Reason for pessimism, I worry some of the panelists, maybe you also, Nicola, mentioned the world is awash in money. The amount of money that is being concentrated in some of these corrupt actors is scary in of itself, and I'm concerned that we're going to get a class of entrenched corrupt government officials in many countries. And the fact is that money is power, whether that means access to ways to retain power and hide money flows, et cetera. So I do worry that at some point they become almost untouchable in certain countries, not everywhere, because of the vast amounts of wealth that they've compiled. I will say this, and I'm purely speaking for myself on this, certainly not IT, of course, all my remarks are that way. I think the answer to that pessimism, and you've mentioned it several times, is the day when the world starts treating this disease with unexplained wealth approach. And it doesn't have to be criminal; it can be civil and administrative. But that's the day that I hope is coming, and that I think is coming. I think that'll be the next watershed event in this fight.
Thank you very much. I would like really to thank all my panelists. I often use an image when I describe what I do as I'm running a marathon, but I have no idea at what kilometer I am. But we don't have any other choice. We all have to run the marathon, and we have to finish the marathon. So with that, I thank very much all my colleagues. I thank again the World Bank for organizing this event, which is indeed a reason to be optimistic. And I invite you to the coffee break. Thank you. Or not.